At a show of hands, how many people here enjoy listening to music? Probably the majority of us, right? And because we enjoy listening to this music, I think the majority of us here have probably heard of things such as YouTube, Spotify, or even TikTok to listen to this music, right? Be it whilst going to work, going to the gym, or studying. I think we can all agree that music has a very special place within many people's hearts. Now, using your best recollection skills, I want you to ask yourself, when was the last time that I looked up the genre classical music for personal enjoyment? Has it been fairly recently, or has it been a while? And if it's been a while, ask yourself, why so? Now you can argue that in today's fast-paced, materialistic society, classical music can have a kind of hard time fitting in, right? If you ask any teenager today if they enjoy listening to classical music for personal enjoyment, do you think the majority of them would respond with yes as a sign of approval? Probably not. And I think you can also argue that popular culture is constantly changing, right? So classical music won't always be the most popular musical genre. And that's very true. But I think a lot of people enjoy looking back to music from their past, right? From their childhood. Like the Beatles are still fairly popular, right? And they were like from, what, the 1950s or so, right? And I think a very common opinion today is that people don't listen to classical music because it's not relatable. It's boring, it's too complex for people to understand. But I think this argument is very flawed because classical music was written for people 300 years ago who had the same intentions as us today, to enjoy music. That's the same purpose. So today, let's try something new. Let's try to portray classical music in a new light by tearing down the scary facade of I don't understand classical music in order to reveal the beautiful interiors that this art subject has to offer. But before we begin, I'd first like to elaborate on the history of Western music. The four most major periods of history within Western music are the Baroque period, from around 1600 to 1750, which saw the rise of popular artists such as J.S. Bach and George Frideric Handel. Next, we had the Classical period, from around 1760 to 1820. And this period saw the rise of famous artists such as Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn. Next, we have the Romantic period, from around 1800 to 1910. And this period saw the rise of very tumultuous characters such as Tchaikovsky and Grieg and Schumann. And finally, we have the Impressionist / post-20th century period of music, which saw the rise of composers such as Ravel and Debussy. So you can see that the history of Western music is actually quite broad. And I think the term classical music is used to denote a very broad range of music, and I think we overuse it in a way that's not entirely accurate. Because classical music actually is specifically for the period of the classical period. And today, we're going to focus on a piece. And this piece is going to be specifically from the classical period. So I think the majority of people here today have probably heard of the piece of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. If you haven't heard of it, it's this very slow and melodramatic piece. And just from hearing the title, what do you think this music is going to sound like? Well, I kind of told you already. But let's look deeper. I want you to ask yourself, what does this music tell me as a person? And what ideas do you think this music is telling me, right? And I'm going to play a small excerpt for you, and I want you to listen. So, what did you hear? Well, you probably heard a lot of things, right? But I think one of the biggest things that probably everyone here heard was that of repetition. And repetition, of course, is the repeating of musical notes. And here at the beginning of this piece, we hear the repetition of a three-note melody. And that three-note melody is G sharp, C sharp, E, right? And this three-note pattern is repeated throughout the piece, right? It might be changed a little bit. And at first, I think it kind of just sounds maybe like a little bit of background music, right? Just da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum. It might not sound very important at first. And we also have this intuition that this three-note pattern has a sort of like, makes the piece sound quite sad, right? And these ideas are all correct. But let's look a little deeper. Let's imagine we're listening to Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata as if we're opening like a very famous novel, right? Or we're looking at some very famous painting, right? For example, let's imagine we're looking at this painting here, right? This painting, what do you see in it? You probably see a lot of things, right? You see maybe, is that a moon in the background? Maybe it's the sun. And we also have this body of water, and we have this lighthouse, right? And if we imagine we're looking at this painting as if we're listening to this music, do we find any parallels between the details in this music and this painting? For example, if we look at the tides in this painting, and we think about our music, do we see tides in our piece? Well, let me think about a tide. What does a tide look like or sound like when I look at a body of water? Well, I think tides are like very repeated, right? They're like in like waves, right? And I also think they're very repetitive, right? Do we see that in our music? Maybe, I think so, right? We have that three-note melody. It's like ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. It's very like, it's like a buoy, right? So could Beethoven be trying to portray this idea that these three-note patterns are supposed to be representing water? Maybe, but let's look even deeper. Let's think about the other melody in this piece, right? We have this, these long chords of right? And these octaves are very ominous sounding, right? Kind of mysterious, like you don't know what's out there, right? And if we look back to our painting, we could assume that the light in the sky could be the moon. And if we think about the moon, isn't it kind of like ominous to see this like bright thing in the sky at nighttime when everything should be dark, but suddenly we see this huge thing in the sky, right? So maybe these long chords could be representing the moon. And then we have this high melody, right? And if we think back to our painting once more, and we look at the lighthouse, doesn't the lighthouse kind of like make you think about like hope, right? Light represents hope, right? So now that we have all these details, what does this mean? Well, out of this presentation, what I want to show you is that classical music is more than just notes. I think a lot of people see classical music as a bunch of random notes that, I don't know, some composer put together and they sound nice. You put them all together and they sound, woo, very pretty, woo, right? But that isn't the case because classical music is so complex. We have different nuances, such as dynamics, which are the changes in magnitude of sound. We have articulation, which is like how you play specific notes. And you have phrasing, and you have different like ideas you want to portray, right? In fact, if you listen to any great artist today, any orchestra in general, and you listen to their playing, what you'll notice is that there's not one orchestra that sounds like another. There might be similar, right? Some artists may try to exhibit things that are very similar to other artists, but in general, each artist is very specific and they're very different from one another. And the ideas that they try to portray are very much like that of like stories. And now that we have our ideas, our small details, let's try to put our small details as if they're like little images, and let's try to string them on one long string, and let's see if we can observe any patterns of development, okay? I'm going to play that excerpt for you again. I want you to listen this time and think about if you hear anything different. So, was there anything different about this time's hearing? Maybe. Maybe you heard something different, or maybe you didn't. And that's okay if you didn't, because that's not the point of this presentation. The point of this presentation was to show you that classical music is much more than we think it is. It's so much more complex. And what I personally want you to feel is that there are different ways to listen to classical music. And my way, of course, is not always the best way. You could argue that it's not correct. It could be a completely false idea, right? And what I recommend to you, you may use, but you might not use also. But what I'm trying to show you from this presentation are these three ideas. Number one, listen to melodies, not just those of main melodies, but supporting ones. And whilst you listen to these melodies, I want you to think about your emotions, right? Because a lot of music encapsulates emotion. And while some music may not have that much emotion, that's okay. But for the majority of music, I think there is some or one piece of music that probably connects to every person within this world. And finally, be attentive to players. The thing that makes classical music so much more different from every other genre is that it demands people to look at how the musician is playing, right? Classical music demands us audience members to watch the person who's playing and seeing what are they trying to say out of their music, right? And of course, this is not one, 2, 3 step thing you can just manage to follow, and you might not follow it. You could argue it's not correct. But I think it's a very interesting way to begin seeing music, to begin seeing classical music specifically. And of course, I can't force you to start loving classical music or start listening to it, but I will encourage you to start giving it a chance, an opportunity, to start thinking about, hey, why don't I just start listening to classical music and see if I like it? I might not like it, but at least I should try and see and listen, right? And you might not ask, Michael, why should I listen to classical music in today's modern sense still? Like, what else? What other things are beneficial besides just listening to classical music for my own personal benefit? Well, there's so much more. And in today's world, there's a lot of problems. One of them being the current pandemic of COVID-19. You see, right now, lots of musicians are suffering from unemployment. And in fact, a study done in 2014 by the League of American Classical Orchestras found that there were over 1,224 classical orchestras out there in the US. And they generated what they generated was that these orchestras generated up to 1.8 billion towards our US economy. I think that's a pretty significant sum. And now, because of the current crisis, a lot of these musicians cannot come together as groups and spread music for us. And that's a big problem because classical music depends on audience members. And when audience members don't show up, they don't have anything to play. They can't play for anyone. But that's where you and me come in. We can start listening to classical music when after this pandemic finishes, or maybe not right now. If we start listening to classical music, we give classical music a bigger chance. We extend its legacy far beyond ours into the future generations, to those even maybe cyborgs. Now, isn't that an interesting thought? Thank you.